that when it comes to this kind of argument, you have to have what he deemed the uncaused cause. Because otherwise, and this is his illustration, so Mr. Axton, if you happen to hear this, here you go, that at some point it's turtles all the way down until eventually you hit the elephant. Welcome back to the show. In our last episode, we were going through some of the arguments about the Christian faith, specifically how do we know God exists. And one of the arguments that we looked at was one called the Kalam Cosmological Argument. And basically it states that if anything began to exist, it must have a creator or a point in which it exists. And we're going to unpack that a little bit more, because I think we need to kind of tackle that and follow up with it, because one of the questions I'm sure somebody is going to ask is, if everything needs a cause, then who created God?
Yeah, what cause? That's one of the common challenges is, if everything needs a cause, what caused God? What created God? But we'll kind of dive into that and see that it's kind of based on faulty assumptions. Right. Based on faulty logic and just kind of a misunderstanding of the Kalam.
Yeah, it very much is, but I think you would agree with me. We want to treat that question with respect, though, because it is, whether faulty logic or not, it is a serious question that people bring up. And it does sound good at first until you start to kind of unpack it and the assumptions that are behind it and kind of the underlying ideas. So we're going to break that question down. We're going to look at it from a philosophical standpoint. We're going to look at it from a logical standpoint and just have an honest, open conversation about why that's probably not the best question to ask when someone presents the cosmological argument. Right. So let's go ahead and start with the assumption behind that question. Who created God?
Well, it comes from that, like I said, that basic misunderstanding of what the Kalam cosmological argument is actually saying. Because the argument says everything that begins to exist has a cause. Okay. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And then through a series of other arguments, that cause is shown to be the God of the Bible. Okay. And so some of it is, I think, maybe just not thinking critically about the argument. Or in some cases, maybe just rushing to a conclusion. Well, if everything began to exist, then, what caused God? That kind of thing. Okay. But again, like I said, it's the key to the Kalam is everything that begins to exist. Keep in mind that the Christian argument, and the Jewish and indeed even the Muslim argument is that God did not begin. He has no beginning. Right. He's eternal. But that's, so he wouldn't ever begin to exist, because in order for him to be God, by our definition, by the definition particularly revealed in the Bible, he couldn't have a beginning.
Right. It's almost as if Moses anticipated that question, inspired by the Holy Spirit, when he wrote in Genesis 1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Notice it doesn't say in the beginning God began to exist or came into existence. It says in the beginning God created. So I think, to your point, when we come at this with this question, we have the presupposition of, well, okay, you say everything that begins to exist must have a cause. Well, God began to exist. That's assuming, well, let's call it what it is. It's not assuming the God of the Bible. It's not assuming the God, well, really, like you said, it's not considering the God of the Bible, the Christian God, the Jewish God, or which even the same. Which is the same, but or the Muslim understanding of God. It's not considering that all three of those Abrahamic religions believe that God is eternal, that he's always existed. So you come at it with the wrong, I guess, presupposition right out of the gate, and that makes it hard.
And I think you can kind of compare and contrast to, maybe some of the Mesopotamian gods, who came into existence out of, if I remember correctly, I think it was Tiamat. Mm-hmm. They were formed out of Tiamat. Well, that goes back to the kind of the beginning, is like, okay, well, where did Tiamat come from?
Right.
And I'm not up on my Mesopotamian religions, but I think she just kind of began.
Yeah.
So she's still, Tiamat still had a beginning, but I don't know that it's necessarily explained.
Well, I had a professor in seminary that he put it this way, that when it comes to this kind of argument, you have to have what he deemed the uncaused cause. Mm-hmm. Because otherwise, and this is his illustration, so Mr. Axton, if you happen to hear this, here you go, that at some point it's turtles all the way down until eventually you hit the elephant. So his point behind that was, as you keep working backwards, if there's not an uncaused cause, you're always looking for that next causation.
Right.
And you keep going and going and going and going indefinitely.
I think that's a reference to, I think it was it Hindu mythology?
Yeah.
Where the world is the back of a turtle that's standing on top of an elephant or something like that.
Yeah. And he'd take in mind that professor taught philosophy in Japan for like 20 plus years, which is hilarious, because he comes to America to teach at a Bible college seminary, and is assuming the freshmen that are coming out of public high school have had philosophy.
Yeah.
Which in Japan, newsflash, they do. In America, we do not.
Yeah. And it wouldn't, we're getting a little bit off the rails here, but, I think that is kind of one of the shortcomings.
Oh, yeah.
In American education. And not to say that it needs to be anything super deep, but I think, if people had a more fundamental understanding of just kind of the basics of philosophy and the basics of logic, an error like this wouldn't be as likely and wouldn't be as common to encounter, because you would think that you would automatically check yourself to say, okay, am I applying the right logic to this argument? Maybe it's because I've taken philosophy and I study and read philosophy on my own, and so I already automatically kind of do that anyways.
Right.
But kind of related, unrelated, I guess, in a way, bringing the education system in. But the question of who created God really is more of like a category error. It's kind of like saying, okay, well, what does the color blue smell like?
Yeah. It doesn't.
It doesn't.
Yeah.
They're completely unrelated, two totally different things that have no relationship to each other.
Yeah, you're trying to apply a rule to something that it doesn't apply to. It's well, I mean, we kind of do this stuff all the time, though. You talked about the basics of philosophy and logic. I think that if we actually taught this stuff in school, we probably wouldn't have half of the harebrained arguments and discussions and debates that we do over stuff that they're category errors. What does blue smell like? Well, blue doesn't have a smell. Are there things that are blue that smell? Yes, but blue itself does not.
And I think some of that too is just kind of people's fear of approaching philosophy. And I mean, I'll be honest, for a lot of people, philosophy in general is just boring and dry. I can appreciate that not everybody likes reading philosophy or listening to philosophical arguments. I get that. Yeah. But, just having that basic education in just very basic, very, very basic philosophy and logic, I think would serve us in a multitude of scenarios.
Well, and I think to your point earlier, it would help us guard against coming up with these category errors and these false arguments that really don't hold water when put up under scrutiny. So let's look at the question before us. Who created God? Again, it assumes or presumes that God had a beginning. But the attributes of God, if God is the cause of the universe, there are certain attributes he has to have by necessity.
Right.
So one of which is he has to be timeless, because time itself began with creation. Genesis chapter 1 says, in the beginning, time, God created the heavens, space, and the earth, matter. So the Bible, whether you're old earth or new earth or whatever have you, gives us a clear timetable that in the beginning, God created the concepts of time, space, and matter. And we could go into what all that is, but because of that, he can't be confined by those things. I won't say he doesn't work within them, but he can't be confined by them. So the other one is immaterial.
Right. Because in order for something can't come from nothing. And, keep in mind that when we the word nothing, we take it to mean empty.
Right.
But, even in let's just say, we're recording this in the church. If we were to take all the pews out, we would say there's nothing in the room.
Right.
Well, that's not entirely true. There's
the walls.
There's
the floor,
the walls. There's the floor.
carpet,
There's air.
Lights,
there's
air.
Light,
you and I.
There's us. But remember, the word nothing means no thing.
Yeah.
It's not just the absence of something. It is literally no thing.
Yeah.
And so, you know what comes from nothing? There's a comedian, and I wish I could remember his name. Nothing.
Yep.
Comes from nothing.
Yeah.
So, in order for God to be God, really, he has to be immaterial.
Yeah. When you talk about nothing coming from nothing, the laws of mathematics tell us that. If you divide something by zero, it's zero. If you multiply something by zero, it's zero.
Right.
You can't have something come out of nothing, because nothing produces nothing. Now, parenthetical thought here, there's a difference between nothing in terms of material versus nothing in terms of absolute nothing.
Right.
And that's an important distinction, I think, that needs to be made. Beginningless, because he is the causing factor, he himself cannot be caused.
Yeah.
We joked about the turtle thing a few minutes ago, but there has to be an uncaused cause.
Yeah. Otherwise, you fall into that infinite regress of contingent causes, which just logically is impossible. It's an impossibility, because and this kind of also comes in with the theories of time, is if it is an actual infinite, then we would have already or never gotten to the point that we're at now.
Right, we wouldn't be here.
We wouldn't be here. So the timelessness and the beginninglessness of God are kind of inextricably tied to. And really, if you think about it, all of these characteristics are kind of inextricably tied together.
Yeah.
Almost dependently on themselves.
So the other thing, we Christians, you all probably have heard Christians refer to God as changeless. Now, this one I think often does get misrepresented, coming from a pastor standpoint. Changeless in terms of aspects of God himself is a valid understanding, because to change requires time. And we've already talked about the fact that God is not bound by time. But to say that God is changeless does not mean that he does not change his mind.
Right.
So, and I think
conscious decisions.
Exactly. And I think, unfortunately, skeptics often try to, when Christian says God is changeless, they try to lump those all together. And when we say as Christians that he is changeless, we're talking about his divine attributes, his character, that kind of stuff. It's not to say that he doesn't relent from doing things or change his mind or coordinate within for example, if Ryan makes a decision, God can take that decision, even though Ryan made it, and use it for good, even if it was bad. That when we talk about changeless as Christians, that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
We are talking about his nature, his character, his divine attributes. And I think that's an important thing for us to clarify, because I think that often gets misrepresented both by skeptics and, let's be honest, by people in the church too.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other, the last two attributes of this cause of the universe, and keep in mind that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the attributes of, yes, these are the attributes of God, and this is what ultimately points to the God of the Bible, but these are the attributes of the cause of the universe,
right?
As articulated in the Kalam. And that the next one would be that immensely powerful.
Oh, yeah.
I think that one kind of speaks for itself, but then personal, because there's a beginning point, there has to be a decision made to create. And in order to make that decision, it has to be a personal entity. It has to be a personal entity, I guess is the best word here.
So what you're saying is, to kind of give this as an illustration, there has to be a personal choice. This pen right here is an inanimate object. It is not going to go up here and then choose to fall, because it can't.
That was really loud, by the way.
Sorry. Some force has to act upon it. I have to make that choice to lift it and then drop it again.
Right.
It's not going to do it on its own. And creation requires there to be a immensely powerful force or agent to create. It's not just going to go, because it can't. It can't make the choice for that to happen.
Yeah. And keep in mind that all of these attributes they're not optional. They're not just, a willy-nilly, I like the power of God, but that personal nature, that personal attribute, I don't really like that, or I don't really like the timelessness, pick an attribute.
Right.
They're all necessarily attributes of God. They're part of his nature.
Well, and I think you'd probably agree they're logically necessary for a creator. They're logically necessary for the actual understanding of how the universe came to be. And I think you're right. Without them, God would not be God. And I think, there's a beauty in this, because they line up with philosophical necessities. They paint a portrait of the biblical God. God says that he is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. He is the great I am. God's covenantal name that he shared with the Israelites is, in English, we often render it Yahweh. If you have an English Bible on your shelf, it'll be a capital Lord. And it literally means I am, I exist. And so God's covenantal name that he gave to his people is basically, I'm here. That's
I exist because I exist.
Yeah, that's just unbelievably revealing when you consider these characteristics of what it would take to create the universe.
Yeah. So let's kind of detour into that philosophy a little bit. And like I said, I know not everybody likes philosophy. Some people find it incredibly boring. There's some even within the church who think it's, I don't know what word they would use for it, but anathema or,
No, I think that's a good word. There are a lot of people that take philosophy to be anathema, heresy, a sin. And there are a lot of people that can just not be bothered with it. As a preacher, one of the common things I heard is, well, I believe that because the Bible says so. Okay. I agree, but do you understand why the Bible says that?
Yeah.
Because the Bible not only is it a book of instruction, not only is it a book of narrative, not only is it a book of all forms of literature, believe it or not, it's also a book of philosophy.
Yeah.
It tells us not only what we should do and what we should think, but if you read the Bible very carefully, it teaches you how you should think.
Right. Yeah.
And most people don't realize that. And I think honestly, back to the thing we said earlier, that's part of the problem we have in our school system. School systems is we stopped using the Bible in the school system. And in my opinion, there's no better book to teach you how to read, how to understand different genres of reading, how to understand how to think, how to understand what to think, understand how to be a moral person, confined in one book.
Right.
I mean, there are other books that do those things, but one volume, I'm all about simplicity. If I can have one book that taught me most of what I needed to be successful as a human being, not maybe successful in business, but successful, and there's Bible principles for business in there too, then yeah, I would like that. But to your point, as we detour into the philosophy, some of you are going to hate this, some of you are going to love it, but brace yourself, because here we go.
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to do a super deep dive because, there are some of these things that we could probably, and there are people that devote entire podcasts, multiple seasons to, the various aspects of philosophy. And, I'm not qualified to do that. And as much as I enjoy philosophy, I know that not everybody, particularly some of the people that would be watching this would really enjoy that. But
they'd be on the struggle bus. Let's just put it that way.
they would be passengers, and I drive the struggle bus way too often anyways. I don't need to add an extra route to my struggle bus. But let's look at what are the other arguments. We've talked about the cosmological argument, but let's look at the ontological argument.
Okay.
So the ontological argument was articulated by Anselm in the 11th century.
Okay.
And basically what it says is, this is what he says. He says, that than which, or hold on, let me back up. God is that than which none greater can be conceived. So basically, God is the greatest conceivable being.
So to put that in layman's terms, God is it in terms of the highest fathomable idea or concept the human mind can formulate,
possibly
or
consider. And if you can conceive of something greater than the attributes of God, well, then that's God. It's kind of one of the problems I think that I kind of have with it is that it's almost like constantly moving the goalpost. If you were going to make an argument against the ontological argument, make an argument against the ontological argument. But you kind of constantly are moving the goalposts.
Okay.
Now, I think the principle holds true, but God is, if you can think of something greater than your current conception of God, well, then that's
the conception of God.
And then, keep following that down the road. Who was it? Leibniz kind of later expanded on that. And I kind of fleshed it out a little bit. And it says, his argument says, God is perfect. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God exists. So basically what he's saying is that existence is greater than non-existence.
Okay.
Which, I could agree with that.
Right.
But there's been some pushback on that as well.
I could see where there'd be some pushback on that, though.
Well, what do you think one of the rebuttals or arguments against that could be?
Well, I mean, we talk about paradise, not like heaven paradise, but like an island. So you could say like there's a perfect island in the Bermuda Triangle where the weather is perfect all the time. There's fresh fruit everywhere. there's bountiful fish. There's, it's just perfect. It never storms there. It never nothing. It is literally just a modern, perfected Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
That might be true, but is it necessary?
Well, it's not. Islands are not necessary beings.
Okay.
And here's the other problem as well: is that using the example of an island, that's kind of subjective, because me personally, I love rainy weather.
Okay.
So for me, my perfect island could be Great Britain. I don't know how many days out of the year it rains in the UK.
A lot.
But, I love rainy days. So does that mean that my perfect island, it's subjective?
Right.
As opposed to, an objective greatness, an objective, pinnacle of attributes.
Okay.
And that was Guanillo that actually gave the perfect island critique. And Immanuel Kant. Man, I cannot talk today. I'm sorry. He says that the ontological argument would describe what God is like if he exists, but he doesn't think that it's good proof that he does exist, that he actually exists.
And do you think maybe Kant saw the problem with the argument, that it would be real easy to, I say easy, I don't mean that in a derogatory fashion, but it would be easy to switch the methodology to something else, like an island.
Sure.
And probably went, I get where you're coming at with it, but probably not what you want to probably not the basket you want to put all your eggs in.
No. And I mean, I think I would agree with Kant in that, I think it is a good argument for the attributes of God, but I don't think it's a great argument for his existence. But by the same token, I think that would be a good argument against his beginning to exist.
Oh, okay.
Because, something, what's greater, something that has existed eternally versus something that, and that's kind of the crux of the argument too, is that, something that has existed eternally is by its very nature and essence greater than something that at which point did not exist. So that's kind of more the argument of Leibniz.
Well, yeah, because if he's the greatest conceivable being, then he would had to have existed eternally. Because if you could conceive something greater than that, then he wouldn't have existed eternally.
Right.
Which, makes sense.
It does. It makes sense to me too. But, all of this kind of ties us into like the three different branches of philosophy.
Okay.
You've got your metaphysics, which is kind of the philosophy of what exists. You've got epistemology, which is really the nature of knowledge. How do we know?
How do we know? Yeah.
How do we know things?
And that's through intuition, reason, and revelation, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have axiology, which is your morality, your ethics,
your beauty,
the aesthetics.
It's interesting because the Bible actually touches on all three of those.
Mm-hmm.
On the metaphysics, Genesis 1:1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The epistemology. I said that right.
Yeah, epistemology.
See, he ain't the only one that can't talk today, folks. Psalm 19, verses 1 and 2, Romans 1:19 and 20 tell us that God's existence is revealed throughout creation.
Right.
Creation clearly shows that there is a creator.
And I would say, kind of on that same note, there are some people who would push back against scientific discovery, and I think, for me anyways, that revelation in nature, those scientific discoveries are, when I read, a scientific article or read about a particular discovery that's been made in science, that draws me closer to God.
Yeah.
Because I get closer to understanding something about the world that He's created for us.
Yeah.
You know, most of the time I'm not thinking about, oh, well, you know, when did this happen? Was this on day 3 or on day 4? You know, I'm not thinking about it in those terms. Right. I'm just thinking, you know, wow, this is an incredible, you know, insert discovery here, and you know, this is just amazing that God created us.
Yeah.
You know, and that's one of the arguments for the personal nature of God, I think, too, is that because His world is discoverable, that means that it's knowable.
Right.
And we can know God through His creation.
Right. Well, and then finally, you know, there's the axiology, which is the morality thing. Hebrews 1:1-2 tells us that God revealed Himself in His Son, Jesus Christ, to show us truth, beauty, goodness, and human form. So it's interesting that when you look at the 3 branches of philosophy, the Scripture seems to utilize them as well.
Yeah.
And it just makes me wonder if that wasn't intentional.
Oh, I'm sure it was. You know, I'm sure it was. And to kind of go back to the morality thing, you know, this may be a bit of a hot take, but can you be moral without the Bible? Can you be moral without God? Yeah, real deep dive on this episode.
Well, I'm going to answer it kind of tongue-in-cheek. Yes and no.
It's a good non-answer.
There's a reason for it. Here's the yes. By the shifting human standards, yes. Depending on how you define morality. In terms of absolute morality, no. And here's why I give that answer. Because what may be deemed by human standards moral in the rainforest may not be deemed by human standards as moral in rural Missouri.
Right.
And I think this is an important thing for us to understand. There are certain moral codes that transcend culture and location. However, the interpretation of some of those moral codes varies to a great degree from culture to location.
Right.
For example, in the United States of America, at least at this point in time, it is illegal to be a cannibal. There are still parts in the world where that is not the case.
Right.
Now, even within those cultures, there are still moral codes around cannibalism. For example, you don't eat your neighbor.
Right.
But if Joe Schmo from Minneapolis comes in, dinner is served.
Yeah.
So there's a moral code there, but it varies from culture to culture. So that's my yes, no answer. Because the world would tell us, yeah, you can be moral without God. By the shifting standard of the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would agree with that. I think that, you know, I can't remember which episode, we've talked about this kind of previously, but, you know.
Probably those.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it was in 2. But, you know, that objective moral standard, that objective standard, while there may be some differences on specifics, you know, how that is implemented, they're still there. The same moral principles, underlying moral principles are there. And I would argue that, you know, yeah, you don't need God to be a moral person. However, you also you need to understand what is the foundation for that morality. By what standard are you going to be judged eternally?
Yeah.
You know, if this world is all that there is, well, then there is no judgment. There's nothing to worry about. You go do what you want to do.
Right.
And, consequences, I won't say it, but.
Yeah, let's not.
Yeah.
Well, and I think on the note, there's also I understand that there's a difference between being moral and being righteous. Because
Right.
moral, you can be a bad person with good morals. I think we talked about this in the episode. If a child graper, that's to get around the YouTube algorithm,
Which, that's wild to me.
goes to prison, and people in prison find out what that person did, they're about to have a very bad time, possibly a very short life in prison.
Yeah.
So there's a moral standard there, but those other people are in prison for, murder, theft, arson, other crimes of that nature, So it's just interesting that you can be moral, but it doesn't mean that you're righteous, because righteous is a legal standing term, meaning you are in right standing with the lawgiver. In this case, we would believe to be God. So I think
arguably could only be God.
Well, I would agree with that.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to understand that as we're talking about this, we're not relying just on philosophy in the abstract. It helps to clear the way, but revelation is what gives us the clarity.
Yeah. I mean, we can, looking at nature, at the revelation in nature, we can come to the conclusion that God exists.
Right.
Now, that's totally different than understanding who God is and what his expectation for us is. And on that note, how we are incapable of living up to that standard.
Yeah.
Which is, spoiler alert, that's where Christ is necessary, where he comes in.
Spoiler alert. Coming episode.
Coming episode.
So let's go back to the skeptic's question. Who created God?
No one.
No one, exactly. God is uncreated. He's eternal. He is the necessary being on which everything depends. So if God were created, then he wouldn't be God. It'd be just another contingent being. As I said earlier, jokingly, it'd be turtles all the way down. He would be like us. And then we would still be asking the question, okay, who created God? Which, by the way, parenthetical thing here, the Jehovah's Witnesses have a problem, along with the Mormons, have a problem with this.
Yeah, they would.
Because of their understanding of how God exists. So if you want to ask this question to someone and have a I got you moment,
yeah,
go knock on a Mormon's door, turn it around on them.
Yeah, Jehovah's Witness, you might not have the same kind of issue with them.
No,
I think that their understanding of God, they more deny the Trinity.
Yeah.
They one of their beliefs is that Jesus is the Archangel Michael, and they view Jesus as a purely created being, and they don't ascribe to the Trinity. But Jehovah's Witnesses is definitely one of the weaknesses in their belief system, is that God was once a man and then elevated to the position of God. God is seen as more of a status as opposed to an ontological being.
Which is where, again, this question would work well with them. But for the Judeo-Christian God, it doesn't really work, because logically and philosophically speaking, the chain of cause and effect has to end with a being of necessity who exists outside of that chain of cause and effect.
Right. Well, and I think it would be helpful to kind of define, we keep saying a necessary being and contingent beings, and I think it would be helpful to kind of define, well, what are we talking about there?
Okay.
So a contingent being is a being that you can kind of think of as not existing. Like it's a possibility, there's a possibility that I was never born.
Okay.
In some possible universe, I don't exist. I am a contingent being.
Right.
A necessary being is a being that of its very nature necessarily, kind of like the name implies, necessarily exists in
Right.
every possible universe. And so if you were to draw it like a grid, and a contingent beings would be blue, and a red being would be, or a necessary being would be red.
Right.
There's a line of red that runs all the way through this particular grid. That's the way one of my philosophy professors drew it out when he was explaining necessary versus contingent. He drew a bunch of boxes on the whiteboard, and he put a blue X for, he had like each one of us in the class. I think there was like 8 of us. And, again, this is just an example. The concept is actually much bigger, but he had each of us named on the whiteboard. And in universe 1, Ryan exists. In universe 2, Rob doesn't exist. In universe 3, Rob and Ryan exist. In universe 4, Rob exists, but Ryan doesn't. In universe 5, neither of them exist. But then through every single one of them, all 5 of those universes, there's one necessary being. So that's kind of what we're talking about there when we're talking about necessary versus contingent.
So I think, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but this kind of reasoning of a necessary being who exists outside of cause and effect, for what we've talked about so far, philosophers would call this the principle of sufficient reason.
Right.
There must be an ultimate explanation that doesn't rely on anything else. Christians and the Jews call him Yahweh, the self-existent one.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess the question is, why do people still get hung up on this?
I think part of it's cultural.
Okay.
I believe firmly that relativism, particularly moral and cultural relativism, is kind of the cause of Western decline. Yeah, I know, big topic.
I don't realize we're getting this deep today, but okay, here we go.
Put the boots on, it's getting deep. There's this idea that all religions are the same, that they all teach the same things, just in different ways. Well, that's...
there are many ways to heaven mantra.
Yeah. And I think that, Hollywood kind of plays a role in some of this. But I think that, which maybe it's more of just a reflection of relativism, but, kind of the way they look at it is, if you were to look at this as kind of a logical argument, for a relativist position, all religions are the same. Odin, Zeus, Aphrodite, all these other gods. Yeah, Thor. They all began to exist, and so because all religions are the same, the God of the Bible must have began to exist. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. My brain is screaming logical fallacy.
Right. But again, I mean, that the kind of the assumption in that is that all religions are the same, that they all teach the same things.
What's it called?
Relativism?
No, the actual philosophical fallacy.
Yeah, I'm drawing a blank.
It's not a I mean, you could argue it's a non sequitur, but it's not non sequitur. It's equivocation fallacy.
Yeah.
Where because A is true and B is like A, therefore B must be true like A in the same form that A isn't true, and it's like no, not necessarily.
Yeah. But what's funny is that when you look at the specific claims of religious teachings, of religious beliefs, that it's very obvious that they can't all be true. They're not.
Right.
They are not all the same. They may be similar, but what matters is not the similarities, but the differences.
Exactly. Well, and a good example of that is, you talk about the fact that people equate, the Norse gods, the Greek gods, the Hindu gods, all the gods of all the religions in the world. Well, because all religions are the same, therefore they're all like Yahweh, but they're not. Yahweh is described as omniscient, all-powerful, omnipresent, outside of the bounds. And when I say outside the bounds of time, understand what I mean is that he's not bound by time. It doesn't mean he doesn't work within time. It means he's not bound to it.
Yeah, go back to episode 4 for that discussion.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And so one of the things about that, though, is there is a vast difference in the power of the so-called gods of the false religions of the world and Yahweh. In a lot of the false religions, the gods have authority over a certain aspect of creation. So, for example, what is Thor, the god of thunder and lightning? There might be some minor things he's in charge of too. Well, but Yahweh's whirlwind is surrounded by thunder, lightning, fire. He parts oceans. He stops time. He causes planets to stop in their rotation. The events described of what Yahweh does in the Old Testament are vastly superior to a lot of the descriptions that we have of the acts of the mythology, the gods of the mythos, of the Greek and Roman variety. And interestingly enough, the 10 plagues of Egypt, when Yahweh acted on behalf of Israel against Egypt, each one of those were an attack on the domain of one of the Egyptian gods.
Culminating in the death of the firstborn.
Right, which was a direct attack on Pharaoh, who was believed to be a god himself, along with actually technically an attack on Anubis as well, but I'm not going to go there. Yeah. But it's interesting because our relativist society says all religions are the same, but Jesus himself says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me.
Yeah, the exclusivity claims made by Christianity are what really differentiate it from other religions. If you notice, the Hindu religion has something to say specifically about Jesus.
Yeah.
Muslims have something to say about Jesus. They all want to bring Jesus in until you come to the exclusivity claims that he makes. And then it's, he was a good teacher. Yeah. Or he was just a prophet. Yep. And then just completely ignore those exclusive
claims. But that's the thing. If Jesus made such exclusive claims, then clearly there's a difference between the Christian faith and understanding than that of the rest of the religions of the world. So it would logically then, at least for me, lead me to understand that then there's probably a difference between the Judeo-Christian God and the gods of the Hindus, the Greeks, and the Romans.
Right.
There's definitely a difference there. And like you said, I think the problem is because our society is so relativistic, it tries to mix all these mythological deities with the God of the Bible. And I think you really see that play out because a lot of skeptics now are trying to say that Yahweh is like the Canaanite storm god or something like that, which doesn't hold up under historical scrutiny, but you understand where they're coming from because they're trying to make that claim, to make that connection, because then it really, what it does is it robs a lot of the back, I don't want to say authority, but a lot of the backing out of the Judeo-Christian claim. But what do we do? I mean, how do we use this in conversation? Because we've covered a lot of ground in this episode. How do we use this in conversations?
I think when you're talking to a skeptic or maybe somebody that's genuinely curious, don't just rush to answer. Don't just rush to give them a response. If you can, if you're able, and time permits, and you've done your studying and you've kind of read up on the topic of whatever they're asking about, particularly if it's about the the cosmological argument or the beginning of God, that kind of thing. Walk them through how to understand, okay, this is where you've made an error in logic.
Right.
Without saying, you made a logical error.
Right.
Or pointing a finger and laughing or even just being dismissive of them, like, oh, you're so stupid. You think God had a beginning. Well, they do, because there's an error in their logic and understanding.
Right.
But don't be quick to jump to condemnations or ridicule.
I think you need to expose the assumption, but you need to do so in a gentle and nice way.
Do it with gentleness and respect.
Exactly, and you need to make sure you understand where they're coming from. We talked about, you said make sure you listen. We talked about this in episode 1. We often listen to respond instead of actually listening to understand. And it's paramount that we listen to understand so that we can make sure that when we do respond, our speech is seasoned with salt, but it is still gracious and respectful.
Yeah, don't want it to be too salty.
Yeah. Don't talk to people that you're trying to share your faith with like you talk to people that maybe you just lost the game on Destiny 2 or Halo 2.
Right. Which you shouldn't be talking to them like that either.
No. Offer analogies. I mean, that's always a good one.
Simple analogies, yeah.
Well, what color, what does blue smell like? When they look at you like you're crazy and go, well, hold on. It's the same kind of argumentation that you're presenting here. I want you to see how this works. Show them it's a category error with the analogies, and again, in a nice, respectful way. Keep it simple.
Yeah, you don't have to memorize Anselm or Leibniz or
Kant or even William Lane Craig. I am a big proponent of something called Occam's razor.
Yeah.
Which is the simplest solution, is probably the most correct. You could say I'm a fan of KISS. Keep it simple, stupid. Because here's what happens. We overcomplicate it.
Yeah.
We want to be right.
Well, we have a tendency to feel the need, and I know I personally struggle with this, but we sometimes feel the need to explain ourselves, as opposed to just putting the information out there and letting the other party ask questions.
Yeah.
We don't want to feel, and maybe it's because we feel like we wouldn't be able to answer if they do ask questions, and so we try to overcompensate and just say more than we really need to say.
Like flood them with information so that they don't, because if you flood them with information, they don't have time to ask a question because they're going, wait, what?
And that's a tactic used by skeptics as well.
Oh, yeah, 100% it is.
They'll do the same thing. They'll bombard you with questions, which they themselves, probably if they thought about it, either could answer, or maybe it's a question that is so kind of ridiculous that it doesn't even warrant an answer.
Or it's a question that they know there is no real good answer to.
Right.
Because they can easily turn it. And honestly, it's a debate. That's a debate tactic. It really is. And again, we want you to have conversations. Now, if you want to take the information that you learned during these podcasts and you want to go have a debate with somebody, you can. I wouldn't recommend it. I'm not going to say we're not intellectually rigorous in our studies, but I'm not going to say that we're professional debaters either. Mm-hmm. And so one of those things is just take in mind that we want you to be able to have conversations. The goal of this is for you to have conversations, not debates, not take your Bible and smack your opponent upside the head until they cry in submission, screaming, "Mommy." We want you to have gentle, respectful, but informed conversations.
And part of that conversation too is living that example. Mm-hmm. If you are saying one thing, but then you're living in a completely different way, well, you have just completely undermined and totally discredited everything that you just said. And so you need to live a genuine life. And, we get it as Christians that we are going to stumble. We're going to fall short. that's going to happen. It's part of we still have until the day the Lord comes, which could be.
We may not even finish this recording.
Oh, no. Okay. But I keep waiting for it. You can interrupt me please interrupt me at any time. I'm ready for it. But everything that we say and do can be completely discredited.
Yeah.
If we're living in blatant sin. That's not the same as falling short. When I lose my temper in the car because somebody, in front of me is driving towards me with their high beams on for the 15th time in the last 5 miles. Pet peeve, sorry.
We could tell.
Right. When I lose my temper, that's not me living habitually angry.
No.
That's me falling short.
Right.
And that's something that I need to repent of. But that's totally different than living in a life of habitual sin.
Yeah.
And if we're living in a life of habitual sin, if we're living publicly in that way, it shows.
Yeah.
And it completely discredits everything that we say.
It destroys your witness. Not only does it destroy your witness, but it makes it impossible for you to maintain your credibility. Before we get too sidetracked on that, though, I also want to point out the fact that it is okay and it is acceptable in these discussions to point out what the scripture says. So, for example, in Psalm 90, verse 2, it says, "Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God." And you may think, well, now wait a minute, what does that do with a skeptic? Well, it gives credence to the fact that what you are stating has been a long-held belief by believers for a long time.
Yeah, it's not a new belief.
It's not a new belief. It's not just something that we made up in the last 100 or 200 years. It's something that the Jews believed. It's something that the Christians believed for the entirety of history that we know of. And I think that's an important thing too. But like Ryan has said, if your life is not matching what you're proclaiming, people are not going to care what you have to say.
Yeah, it doesn't matter what you say.
Yeah, because you will steal your own thunder. So let's wrap it up. The question, who created God? It sounds powerful, Ryan, but it's really built on faulty assumptions.
Yeah, it's bad. It's based on bad logic, and it's kind of based on not listening to or misunderstanding. Mm-hmm. Let's be generous here. Misunderstanding the cosmological argument, where everything that begins to exist has a cause, and so the assumption is, okay, what caused God?
Right, and because God is a necessary being, He never began to exist. He's always exist, and all other realities depend on Him. If there was ever a time when God didn't exist, then nothing would exist.
Right.
Because, as you said earlier, nothing can't come from nothing.
Something can't come from
something can't come from nothing. Yes,
nothing comes from nothing.
Right.
Something.
I got it backwards.
Something.
I need more coffee. But most importantly, the God who has no beginning or ends invites us to a relationship with Him.
Yeah.
And I think that is absolutely amazing.
It is, and that means that God is knowable. He's personal and personable, and He desperately wants a relationship. Desperately, I say desperately. He's not desperate for anything.
No.
God doesn't need us. He didn't need to create us, but He does sincerely want a relationship with each and every one of us. And that's just the idea that a being like God that has existed eternally, who has no need for me, wants a relationship with me. That's, I don't know, it gives me warm and fuzzies. I love it.
It does. And it's a relationship that has been broken because of sin, and yet God did something about that to restore that relationship. And he wants us to have a relationship with him to the point that his son took the first step. But yet that's another area that comes under attack.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later, though.
All right. That's all we have for you today. God bless. We'll talk to you later.